All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast, back to the YouTube channel. Happy to welcome back. It's only been a week or two, so this is a blessing, really, to get you back. David Frum, welcome back to the news.
Thank you.
You have a great essay that I want to get to about Woodrow Wilson and the Atlantic, which is incredibly thought-provoking, and I think we'll have a good discussion. But first, I just have to ask you, because I know you've also written about this border bill and the Atlantic, and I saw you were on Morning Joe as well. What the heck is going on in Congress?
Well, there's actually a link between the article we're going to discuss about the events of 100 years ago and the most dramatic events of the past 2 days, because they remind us of the radicalism, power, and importance of the concept of collective security. What the border bill is ultimately about is that House Republicans have become, at Trump's prodding, increasingly hostile to the Ukrainian cause. They just don't see why. Trump loves Russia, and they don't care one way or the other. So why not do it Trump's way on Ukraine? What's at stake for the United States and the world? And so we're going to cover maybe the century from the beginning of collective security to the end, with the United States jettisoning it. What's happened on the border is simply that Republicans have had a series of demands. I've been writing about the immigration from a hawkish point of view for a long time. And the basic Republican ask has always been, we want more enforcement. We want a reform of the asylum-seeking system, because more and more of the people who are crossing unauthorized are coming not as true illegal immigrants, but as asylum seekers trying to use the law rather than avoid the law. And we want no pathway to citizenship, no amnesty, nothing like that. And Biden and the Democrats in this negotiation said, right, what if we do it almost exactly 100% your way? And we drop all of our most cherished demands. We give you your most cherished demands, including your border wall. And in return, we ask for assistance to Ukraine. And the Republicans said, that thing we asked, that list of our demands in exchange for none of your demands, we've changed our mind. We don't want it, because our real priority is chaos on the border and stiffing Ukraine.
It's crazy though, right, David? Because as an old school, and by the way, happy birthday to Ronald Reagan, wherever you are. February 6th, when we're recording this, as a sort of old school Reagan conservative, saying, in order to get aid for Ukraine, we will give you border security, would be like, hey man, you want some chocolate cake?
Yeah.
It's like, I don't know. How about if Cindy Crawford delivers it to you? It's like I don't even understand why you need leverage for Ukraine. Like, Republicans should want to support Ukraine, and then they're going to throw in border security like as icing on the cake. Not bad.
Speaker Johnson repeatedly said at the beginning of his tenure that he wanted to do something on Ukraine, but that was obviously bad faith. He did not want to, or rather, Donald Trump doesn't want to, and they all fall in line with that. But what's at stake here is if the United States, out of pure spite and partisanship and willfulness and whatever mysterious, sinister relationship Donald Trump has with Russia, if it abandons Ukraine now and they lose the war, it's not just Ukraine that goes. I mean, the whole structure, look, collective security, the way to think of it is it's ultimately like a structure of credit. That it's like, a very rich man doesn't have to carry a lot of cash. He goes to the club, signs a chit for lunch. They know he's good for it. He orders goods and services. He makes deals. He's good for it. Everyone knows that, and so he doesn't have to present cash all the time. Well, the Western Alliance has been like that rich man. That there's credit when President Biden at the beginning of war Gaza said to Iran, "If you're thinking about it, don't." He was using credit, not cash, but the credit required depends on meeting obligations. If that rich man's chit from the club comes back unpaid, suddenly the whole structure of credit collapses. Now, there are people on the right who say the way to deal with America's many pressing demands is to default on some obligations, and that way you have more credit for others. So the way you prove to the bank that you're good for the mortgage is you don't pay the light bill, you don't pay the credit card bill. You say, look, by stiffing all my other creditors, I've amassed so much cash that I can pay you. There's not a mortgage company in the world that will be reassured by that. They'll just say, you're a deadbeat. And you're obviously beyond your ability to pay. And you probably sooner or later will default on us too. So we're just foreclosing on the house right now. That the United States is about to default on Ukraine. It is defaulting on other obligations too, and that's going to raise questions about this whole structure of guarantees. And the next time the United States has a security challenge, it won't be able to use credit, which is don't do it. It will have to use cash, which is actual military force.
What do you think of Senator James Lankford? What was he thinking? Because I'm reminded of Senator Marco Rubio about 11 years ago,
Yeah.
who was sort of at the time had these Tea Party bona fides and kind of ushered through an immigration bill that did have security provisions, but also had a pathway to citizenship that was attainable. And he went and he sold it. He tried to sell it to Sean Hannity and Rush Limbaugh, got a little bit of buy-in. And I don't know if you remember this, David, but there was this thing called Marco phones. Breitbart, this was this isn't the thing that killed the bill per se, but it's indicative of what a thankless job it is trying to be a conservative who negotiates an immigration bill. Breitbart came out with this report that illegal immigrants who cross the border would receive a free cell phone, according to the provisions in the bill. Really, what it was it's called a Marco phone, is what they dubbed it. It was actually satellite phones, so that ranchers who were, American citizens who were living in parts of the border that were desolate could report
Yeah.
illegal crossings. But it destroyed the bill, and it also undermined Rubio's credibility. So I don't know what James Lankford was thinking when he signed up for this.
Well, there are many morals to that first story. One of the morals of the story is it's very difficult for a Republican to operate in an environment where the information sources your own followers trust most are pathologically dishonest. And so the idea that they would lie to you, how do you, that people turn to more partisan trusted media to know what to think about things. So how do you cope with negotiation, which involves some give and take, when your own most trusted media will so intentionally tell lies? And that has been a problem for Republicans for years. It's a problem for Senator Lankford. This bill that Lankford produced, or this agreement, it's not a bill, or this draft bill, was much tougher. I mean, this was all the things that in 2010 that Republicans said, well, we're not satisfied with what McCain got or what Rubio got, because they have pathways to citizenship, they have some amnesty path. We don't want any of that. And Lankford, dealing with the Democrats, said, okay, gone. No amnesty provision of any kind. Nothing for the dreamers. No pathway to citizenship. It's all enforcement. And not only enforcement, but even more difficult is reform of the asylum system, plus your wall, your physical barrier. And what he bumped into is Republicans, you know what? We actually don't like deals. That's the real problem. Our vision of how things work is the strong man with his fist. He gives orders, and the Democrats cower and tremble and yield. And so not only do we get our way, but we do it by humiliating our opponents and getting them to say we are beaten, we are defeated. You say, well, really? Well, you better win some elections then, if you want. You better not win them close. You say, okay, we're off a string of losing the popular vote for the presidency by 3 million votes in 2016, losing the House in 2018, losing the presidency by 7 million popular votes in 2020, losing the Senate in 2021, having the worst down ballot performance of the out party since the 1930s in 2022, and losing a bunch of judicial races in 2023. And on the basis, we have a non-functional majority in the House of Representatives, and that's our one card. We have nothing else. And on the basis of this slim, dysfunctional majority in the House of Representatives that has already devoured one speaker and may devour more, we demand that our will prevail. And the other people, like, do you know how to play this game at all? That's when a party actually has overwhelming majorities, it still can't do that. And when you are just when you've lost the popular vote again and again and again, you have no basis for this. So actually, what Lankford produced was he went into the poker game with a pair of twos and a pair of threes, and he came away with almost all of the pot. And you say, no, that's pretty good playing. actually. We should just take our winnings, wish everyone a good night, and hope we don't get mugged in the driveway on the way home. But instead, no, with our pair of twos and pair of threes, we not only want the pot, we want to take the house of the person who hosted the game. And it's just not realistic. And any professional politician would have to know that. But this is a party that is not interested in politics. It is interested in this fantasy that by pure willpower and browbeating, you can get your way even when you don't have the clout.
Well, I love how, the argument for not doing it, and there was a few. Brian Kilmeade, nice guy, he's been on the podcast, but on Fox and Friends, he was interviewing James Langford, and he was basically saying, when voters see that Chuck Schumer wants this, and Kamala Harris wants this, and Joe Biden wants this, we say, there must be a trap. There must be something wrong with them. Like, okay. Then you got like people like Donald Trump saying, Biden, we can't do this because Biden needs it. Like, yeah, that's why he's willing to do something he doesn't want to do, because he's desperate, because he's vulnerable. Like, the fact that Biden is being pressured to agree to a bill that will probably upset some of the progressive base, a lot of the progressive base, because it's only got security, it doesn't have a pathway. Like, that's a victory, right? Take the L, take the W, but they can't.
The problem is the Republicans are like a bad businessman in a negotiation, because he actually cannot figure out assets and liabilities, income and costs, because he doesn't know whether the deal in front of him is a good deal or not. He suspiciously says no to everything, because his only way of measuring whether the deal is a success is whether the other guy says no. If the other guy says yes, it must be a bad deal. And if you can't figure out the deal for yourself, you're very vulnerable. So one of the things that good negotiators begin with is understand the deal, understand what you need, and understand what the other guy needs. And in the modern Republican world, it is a point of principle. The other guy gets nothing. We win, you lose. That's the only way. And because we don't know anything about the substance, the only way we can measure whether you've lost or not is whether you're really unhappy. So if there's a deal, by definition, we're being taken advantage of, and we are too uninformed to know whether that's true or not. And because our own right-wing media are so chronically dishonest, we have no way of actually accurately assessing how we're doing. And the result is, what's going to happen is there's going to be probably no deal. There's going to be continued chaos on the border. It probably won't be enough to defeat Joe Biden. And then the Democrats will probably do better in Congress next time. And the next deal on immigration is going to look like a Chuck Schumer bill.
So I'm curious how you think this redounds politically. Like, on one hand, Biden now has the receipts. Trump is on the record essentially saying, I want to kill this bill because if we pass it, it will hurt me politically. You've got the border security professionals and unions saying this is a good bill. So it seems, to people paying attention, that there is documentation that this is a good bill that Republicans have torpedoed because they would rather have the political issue than the policy deliverable. But on the other hand, Biden has not demonstrated to me that he can score points, even when he's technically right, that he can. In a bad border, maybe that just hurts Biden, no matter whose fault it is. What do you say?
I have a very simple model of how politics works in the Trump years, and this has been true now for 8 years. Through 2016, 17, 18, every poll that you did on any subject read as follows: blah, 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 Trump, blah, blah, blah. Answer: 53 no, 47 yes. That's the math. Anything with Trump's name on it has 46, 47 versus 53 against. The Trump advantage has been that the people who like Trump like him a lot. So his 46, 47 is reasonably solid. And the other 53 is a little bit more vociferous. It's less reliable. So what this election is going to be about is Trump's going to get 46 or so percent of the vote. If there's a really strong wind at his back, he might get to 47. I doubt it, but he might. And then everything will turn on whether the other 53% all coheres behind Biden, or whether the projects to stand up Bobby Kennedy and Joe Manchin and Cornel West and Jill Stein, whether those work. If any of those projects work, then Trump, the way he wins the presidency is the election turns out to be 46 Trump, 48 Biden, and then the rest divided among the also-rans. But if it's a two-way binary split for Trump versus Biden, it's be 46-53, 47-53. So the only story here, it's not the border, it's do the third-party candidates gain any traction? And if they do, then Trump has hope. If they don't, then I don't believe he does.
All right, I want to turn to Woodrow Wilson, and I've got some specific questions from this very good essay I want to ask you. But first, at the beginning of the conversation, it sounded to me like you were saying that Woodrow Wilson is the beginning of kind of the international order of America being involved in the world for better or worse, trying to form alliances. And now maybe we have reached the conclusion of that. Is that overstating it?
No, but it's missing a point that I think is important. Woodrow Wilson is not the first president to be involved in the world by any means. America emerges as a great power in the 1890s, and you have strong presidents like McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt. McKinley fights the Spanish-American War. Teddy Roosevelt crushes the Philippines insurrection. These are the Panama Canal. These are very ambitious foreign policy presidents. The differences between Wilson and them is demonstrated when the United States is contemplating what to do about entering the First World War. Teddy Roosevelt and many Republicans were very eager to enter the First World War. It was not an isolationist versus interventionist battle. If anything, Wilson was more reluctant to enter. But as Wilson was drawn into entry, he kept insisting that our security comes about in cooperation with other nations. And I quote some of his speeches on that. That's the new idea. Is that the United States will not find its security alone. When Wilson says the world must be made safe for democracy, one of his most poorly understood remarks, many people interpret that to mean he meant the world must be made democratic. That's not what he meant. What he meant was that American democracy and similar democracies elsewhere depend on certain conditions to flourish. And those are conditions that the United States cannot impose by itself. So Wilson isn't the first strong foreign policy president. At least McKinley is, maybe even predecessors. It's Ulysses S. Grant who chases the French out of Mexico, but no, at least McKinley. But Wilson is the first to integrate American security in partnership with other nations. And then that idea goes out of fashion with his next three successors and only comes back into fashion during the 1940s. So collective security is not interventionism. Collective security is finding security in partnership with others and realizing that the United States alone, no matter how strong, will never be strong enough to be secure. But the United States in partnership with others can be strong enough to be secure.
Now, we teased this conversation a week or so ago in our last podcast discussion. But basically, Woodrow Wilson has been effectively canceled, just like a lot of our history has been canceled. The problem Wilson has is that it's really in nobody's incentive to promote him. If you're on the left, you can look at the racism and the anti-Semitism. If you're on the right, well, he's a Democrat who gave us the tax, the income tax. And now if you're sort of a America First, which is a Woodrow Wilson term, ironically, right? But if you're an American firster, he got us involved in this, great war. But so I want to say up front, this is not an attempt, this essay you wrote is not an attempt to whitewash Woodrow Wilson. I do think it's an attempt to put it in context. And one of the things that you do in that regard is that you say, yes, Woodrow Wilson's bigotries are true, but they were shared by his, the presidents that preceded him and succeeded him.
Yeah. Well, look, there's a lot of people have an interest in making Wilson seem more in one way, Wilson is unusual. So Wilson is the first Southern-born president between Andrew Johnson and Lyndon Johnson. Although Wilson did not make his career in the South, he studied in the North. He became president of Princeton. He became governor of New Jersey, not a Southern state, and he spoke without a Southern accent. So in many, and he was always very emphatic that it was good and right that the North won the Civil War. So he was not, in that sense, a Southern ideologue in the way that some of his contemporaries were. But he had inherited a certain number of prejudices. And in a way, he got the worst of both worlds with his prejudices. Because he inherited the unquestioned white supremacy and the belief that only white people are proper political citizens of a state from the Southern tradition. At the same time, I quote one of his colleagues from Bryn Mawr, who was the daughter of an abolitionist preacher, and she was making the point that at least the Southerners, however offensive their political views were, many of them had had warm personal relationships with people of color, African Americans and others, whereas Wilson had none of that. That she said, this colleague on the Bryn Mawr faculty said that he was the only Southern man she had ever met who had no feelings of warmth for any individual Black person. So there's a kind of frost. It wasn't just a political system of bigotry, but it was a kind of personal frostiness that I think was very unappealing. And one of the worst stories about him is twice he gets a certain amount of support from the Black intelligentsia in 1912. W.E.B. Du Bois endorses him because they're very mad at Franklin Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, because Roosevelt, so Black Americans had made their home in the Republican Party from the Civil War, but they are disenchanted by Roosevelt and Taft. They're disenchanted by Roosevelt because after the blowback, Roosevelt does indeed have Booker T. Washington to dinner. I think the first Black dinner guest at the White House. Lincoln had received Black delegations, but never for a meal. So Roosevelt receives them, and there's a whole set of protocol and egalitarianism that goes with that. And there's a huge blowback. And then reeling from that, there was an incident at the end of the Teddy Roosevelt presidency where there was a conflict between Black troops stationed, I believe, in Texas and some townspeople. And there was violence, and the exact rights and wrongs of the matter are complicated, but Roosevelt ended up signing death warrants for a number of the Black soldiers involved in this altercation. And Black America was very upset by that. And then Taft decided the whole Reconstruction project was out of date. And in his inaugural address, he says, we accept that Blacks are not going to be citizens in the South. The whole attempt to give Black people voting rights was a mistake. So a number of Black Americans are offended by that, especially.
Wow. So I didn't know this. Taft said the idea of making Black people U.S. citizens was a mistake.
Making them voters was a mistake.
Making them voters.
Yes.
Well, wow. I didn't know that.
In his inaugural address, where he also, by the way, endorses Asian exclusion. So W.E.B. Du Bois and the other sort of big brains in the Black world are, they say the time has come to reconsider our loyalty to the Republican Party and to give this man Wilson a try. Wilson is very good at ambiguity. He leads them to think that he might be more open. And then they're bitterly disappointed. And there are two meetings, one in 1913 and one in 1914, where delegations of Black leaders come to see Wilson, and Wilson sort of is very evasive. But the second meeting is the one where a man named Monroe Trotter, who is an important newspaper editor, confronts Wilson. And Wilson is so outraged by being challenged to his face by a Black man that he does something he almost never do, Wilson was a man of volcanic temper, but he seldom showed it in public. And on this occasion, it slipped through, and he threw them out of his office and told them that they'd spoiled the whole cause for which they had come. So these things are all true about Wilson, but and there's a kind of extra personal animus in him that wasn't there, that wasn't there for the others. But the idea of making him, when people say things like he segregated the civil service, they have no idea what what did that mean? What was the civil service like in 1911? That there was a lot of informal discrimination, and there was a lot of informal segregation. Blacks were not allowed to use lunchrooms in government departments, but it hadn't ever quite risen to the level of policy. It was not articulate. It was not written down. It was just things that were done. And by the way, there was not much Black employment in the federal government, but there were a certain number of slots that were reserved as patronage slots because of the Republican Party's patronage needs. So a certain number of messengers in the federal government. There's certain jobs that were a recorder of deeds for the District of Columbia, that kind of thing, that were reserved as quota jobs, token jobs. So Wilson formalizes and makes worse the segregation and formalizes it. But his successors do not dismantle it. So the idea that it's left in place by Harding and Taft. Hoover takes it some tiny little steps, but basically leaves it in place. Franklin Roosevelt takes more, but basically leaves it in place. It only begins to be really dismantled under President Truman. Roosevelt he issues an executive order forbidding segregation in war industries. He desegregates the Coast Guard, I think. But the United States fights the Second World War with segregated military units. It's only Korea is the first non-segregated war since the Civil War. And even in the Civil War, they were segregated. The units were segregated, and the higher officers were always white.
Now, you note that the darkest days of his administration occurred during his period of feebleness. This is like when Wilson maybe wasn't even running the country, right?
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
So Wilson has a series of minor strokes that start probably as early as his first term. And so his temper, he becomes more peevish and querulous and self-righteous, probably with something to do with his health conditions. But he suffers a devastating stroke in the fall of 1919, which leaves him bedridden, immobilized, and which greatly impedes his communication ability. And there are question marks about how much he understood on the inbound track, but pretty clearly he was very impaired on the outbound track. His wife and doctor would sometimes bring in visitors to see him, and with a lot of preparation, they would get him sitting up in bed, and he could more or less talk coherently. But it's not clear how much he ever actually knew about what was going on about events after October of 1919. And he's in office until, of course, March of 2021. So all the information controls all the information flows are controlled and probably suppressed. And there's a lot among the things to criticize him about him is he of course should have resigned in October of 1919 or within a few weeks afterwards. But he not only refused to resign, he thought he was going to run again for president in 1920, and at the time of his death was scheming for a comeback in 1924. He just would not accept that he was not physically able to do it. So, but a lot of like the Palmer raids and things like that, the worst of those things happened during his period of feebleness.
Can we blame? Is it Edith? Is it his chief of staff or something? Or is he calling the shots except not in his right mind? Do you have any sense of that?
I think Edith is doing what he wishes. We blame Edith because a truly loving spouse would have said, you know what, darling, your health, your survival, you should resign. And the country would be better off. But because Wilson never respected his own vice president, and because the Edith Wilson marriage was a second marriage, and she had no children, they didn't have children together. He was everything, and she loved being the wife of the president. So not just out of her devotion to him, but I think for selfish reasons of her own, she and then working with his doctor accepted very easily the false idea that he could carry on. He should have resigned, and the 25th Amendment is a solution to that. But there's something very particular I want to say. We're talking about this because you talk about his unique bad reputation. I want to talk about this is the thing I've really come on to with you. I want to talk because on the conservative side, a lot of the denigration of Wilson is the product of a project to upvalue Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. Because of the Depression, they were all cast in shadow, and there's a big tax cut under Harding and Coolidge, and because Republicans wanted to recover the reputation of those three presidents, they have denigrated Wilson for reasons right and wrong. So the thing I want to say is, without making this personal, I mean, Harding was a convivial person, and although his administration was riddled with corruption, he himself just seems to have been, as Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who hated him, said, he wasn't a bad man, he was just a slob. So Harding, he was convivial, he was good-humored, he was never a hater. He was not an unattractive person, even if he wasn't of the caliber to be president. Calvin Coolidge was a man of extraordinary integrity, and again, not a brilliant mind, but a man of character. And Hoover, of course, was one of the greatest Americans of all time, and if he had never become president, would be remembered as, with George Marshall. One of these people oh, if only Hoover had become president because of his, I mean,
Yep.
extraordinary abilities. He's the man who invents the idea of disaster. He saves hundreds of thousands of lives in Belgium during the war. He saves millions of lives of famine relief in Russia during the Russian Civil War. He introduces disaster relief in the United States after the terrible hurricane in 1928, I think. He invents the idea that the federal government can have a role rescuing large numbers of people from disaster, and not only invents the idea, but carries it out and carries it out with extraordinary, I mean, a great, great, great man. So why do they deserve their bad reputations? And that's the thing I really want to talk about. So, and why the election of 1920 is such a pivotal. The First World War ends with this massive ruin and financial disaster. Northern France and Belgium and Poland are just ravaged. Um, young men have been killed all over the continent. There are amputees everywhere. The German economy is in terror. Germany has financed the war in a very inflationary way, and that inflation then ends up destroying the savings. There's the inflation of 1923, which was more complicated, but there is inflation in 1919, 1920 that has already destroyed middle class savings. But you're left with this big pile of debt everywhere. Germany owes reparations debt to France and Belgium to make up for the terrible things they did on French and Belgian soil. Belgium, France, and Italy owe money to England, from which they borrowed extensively. England and France owe money to the United States, from which they borrowed extensively. There's this massive cycle of debt. The only way that this debt is going to be managed in a responsible way is Germany, especially, but also Belgium and the other industrial countries, have to export like crazy to earn the dollars to buy the food and service their debts. That's what happened after World War II. That the defeated powers, but all the powers they run massive trade surpluses with the United States, and they get the dollars. That's what needs to happen in 1921, 22, 23. Instead, it's Republican Party doctrine, then as now, to cut taxes at home and pay for that by raising tariffs against foreigners. And although Smoot-Hawley is the tariff that is remembered, actually the two most disastrous tariffs are those of 21 and 23, which Smoot-Hawley is even higher, but world trade has stopped anyway, so it doesn't do that much harm. But these two tariffs cut off the ability of Germany, Belgium, France, Britain, Italy to export to the United States. So how do they get dollars? How are they to get dollars? Because that's how they pay for their food. That's how they pay for their debts. The only way they can get dollars is by borrowing. And so Germany in order to pay its way, it accumulates this massive private sector debt to American banks, borrowing and borrowing more money, which it then uses to finance its own consumption and to pay its obligations to France and Belgium, which France and Belgium and Italy can then pay England. England can then pay the United States, and that's how you cycle the dollar, by borrowing them, not by earning them. And that structure of debt is the fuel out of which the Great Depression is made. Because when things go wrong, and I won't be too technical about this, but you have this cycle of indebtedness, and interest rates rise, and countries can't pay their debt, and they bump into the hard constraint of the gold standard, because you cannot run deficits because you'll be forced off gold, which people then think is the end of the world. That's the origin of the Great Depression. When people rehabilitate Harding and Coolidge and Hoover, what they're also rehabilitating are the tariffs of 1921 and 23. And the generation that lived through the Depression and the 25, 30 years afterwards realized that was the best opportunity to avoid all the bad things that had happened. Is the United States needed to run trade deficits, Germany and the others needed to run trade surpluses. It should have been allowed, and because it wasn't, that's where all the future calamities originate. And that's what the ideological project of rehabilitating Harding and Coolidge is designed to conceal.
One of the points you make when we're talking about Woodrow Wilson in terms of the bigotry and things like that is that back at this time, things were like unsorted, and you could have someone who was like very pro black, open minded, but also anti Catholic, for example. And you could have someone who was, like a liberal, but they were like social Darwinist or something. Talk, if you would, about how that should help us understand Wilson and put him in context.
Well, they're sorted in different ways than the way we sort now. So as you say, people project our ideas of progressive and conservative back in time. And it works for a while. But the farther back in time you go, the stranger the landscape is. You get plants that don't exist anymore. Small little talking, walking lizards. Um, so what you talked about, yeah. So a Republican of the generation of Henry Cabot Lodge, who is leader of the Senate after 1918 and Wilson's greatest foe. So Lodge is a Yankee of the Yankees operating in Massachusetts. His political arch enemies are Irish and to a lesser extent Italian Catholics. And he's got a very hostile view to these new immigrants that are corroding his power base in Massachusetts. In the 1890s, there's a terrible lynching in New Orleans, one of the worst lynchings in American history. And the victims are Italian Americans. There is a political assassination. Maybe there's a mafia element. These Italians are charged. Maybe they were involved with the mafia. Maybe they weren't. A jury lets them go, and maybe the jury was tampered with by the mafia, and maybe it wasn't. But anyway, a crowd of white Louisianans burst into the prison and grab, I believe, 11. It's in the article. I believe 11 men and lynch them. Lodge defends this. Because he generally thinks that Catholics are such a sinister influence, Irish especially, but Italians too. And he believes the mafia allegations. And anyway, mob justice is the right way to deal with them. So you think, aha, a bigot and a reactionary. But this same Lodge is also the most stalwart defender of black voting rights in the House. He's not in the Senate yet. He's in the House in the 1890s. And he introduces the most effective, it's defeated, but the most effective guarantee of black voting rights that you will see until the 1960s. So we would say, well, how can he be so hostile to Catholics and also Jews and so friendly to blacks? That's contradictory. If you asked Lodge himself, he'd say, no. My people, the Yankees, need the black Americans as allies against our true enemies, Catholics. And that kind of thing would operate in reverse. A lot of progressives.
Sounds like Trump.
That's just that. Look, politics is what do they say? What is the art of who hates who? That's the art of politics. So Lodge hated Catholics, so therefore he was friendly to blacks. And by the way, this would operate in reverse. That a lot of the women's suffrage people were very hostile to Roman Catholics. Were very hostile. Sorry, that's not a reverse. That's the same thing. You'd see that with a lot of the women's suffrage people. They would be hostile to Roman Catholics, and so they looked to black Americans as their allies. On the other hand, many of those who had progressive causes of other kinds would be segregationists. The world mapped differently. Those of you who study law may know a case called Pierce v. Society of Sisters, which is a case where the state of Oregon tries to ban German language instruction during the First World War. And the Pierce in this case is the man who's the governor of the state, William, I believe his first name is, I may have that wrong. Pierce is, anyway, he's the governor of Oregon, and he passes this draconian act. He was also an early environmentalist, an early advocate of women's suffrage, an early supporter of progressive approaches to mental health. I mean, the world just was shaped differently. And one of the reasons that studying history is so useful is when you understand that the world was shaped differently once, you realize, I bet it will be shaped differently in the future. And it helps you understand the contingency of our political ideas, that these political cards will be reshuffled again and again. And a lot of combinations that seem natural in the 2020s will look pretty strange from the perspective of the 2070s and 2080s.
Now, everyone should obviously read this. We've only scratched the surface. Fascinating, insightful. But before I let you go, David, I would love for you to sort of talk about cancel culture and canceling history and why it's important for us to to study Wilson and remember Wilson, even though we don't agree with everything Wilson, and if we find some of the things that Wilson did distasteful, and yet we shouldn't write him out of history. Why is that so important?
It's not just because I think the cancelers wouldn't say write him out of history. But what they want is what they are advocating for is a highly morally loaded approach to history, highly loaded with the values of the present, and quite indifferent to the problems and context of the past. So I don't want to tell you not to judge, but I want to urge you judge in an informed way. Judge. So you have to know if you before you judge Wilson, you have to know about Taft and Coolidge and Harding, and you also have to understand what did they give us. And this is, I think, maybe the main point I want to say is we live in a moment where there's a lot of doubt about the validity of what America is doing in the world. People on the left doubt the justice of America at home. People on the right now want to abdicate from America's role in the world. Um, if you are going to be a defender of the American project and the American idea, you owe a debt to the people who built it. And they're not all going to be people you like in every way, but you still owe them. And you owe them at least understanding and maybe some gratitude too, even if they were imperfect. And we can go through the roster of prominent Americans, including many who never made it to the presidency. So, you know what? Uh, that's kind of shocking that they did this thing or that thing. But that doesn't make them less great. And that doesn't make me less beholden to them if I appreciate the great and good country they bequeathed to me.
Totally agree. Have you gotten any major pushback for writing this so far, or have you been surprised maybe that that people are in agreement?
Um, I I think it's still the article's only been available for a very few days, so I haven't received major pushback yet. Um, and I think there hasn't been major pushback in part because a lot of the criticism of Wilson, I mean, like there's the crazy people, the people who believe in the Federal Reserve as a demonic plot, um, but a lot of the criticism is based on not really wrestling with the details. And because this article wrestles with the details, I think it's had a kind of immunizing effect that people, are reminded, okay, before I go on the counterattack on this point, I need to wrestle with more of those details myself. And then that would be a positive thing because um, just so long as you really understand the past, I mean, that's the beginning. And then the disagreements that come from understanding are always more useful than the disagreements that come from non-understanding.
I sent this to my good friend David Pietrusia. I don't think he would mind me saying this. He's the author of the book 1920. Um, and he's a noted Wilson hater. And I asked him to read this essay and give me his, what does he think? And he said, I could quibble about a few things, but pretty much spot on. So take that.
Thank
I
you.
took that as a good sign.
Well, I think what we need to at any given moment, we're preoccupied with certain aspects of the past. And one of the things that in the in until very recently we said, well, look, free trade and collective security, we all agree on that. So maybe we don't have to think so hard about the people who gave us those things. I think today, the fact that free trade interlude from 1913 to 1921, the beginning of a more modern approach to monetary policy and that mitigated the hardships that were dealt by the gold standard, and above all, the beginning of collective security of some effort, as imperfect as it was. And there are many ways to criticize Wilson on this because he was not yet a fully modern person, but to understand that democracy, to be safe, must partner with other democracies. Those are things that are suddenly contentious again, and we need to remember how those ideas got introduced into American politics.
Amen. All right. Well, obviously, go to The Atlantic and read this essay about Woodrow Wilson. Also, read David's piece about the border and Speaker Mike Johnson. Anything else that we should plug?
That's a lot for one day. So thank you for those plugs.
Awesome. Well, always a pleasure. David Frum, thank you for coming back on the news.
Bye bye.